Good morning, everybody. It's a slightly rainy day in April here on the West Coast. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm directing the Center for Global Studies. And before we start off, let me underline that we acknowledge and respect the Konrad peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the song is the Song peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. With land acknowledgement, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Victor Konrad here back to Victoria. Victor has been a very loyal friend of the Borders and Globalization project, a co-applicant, if I'm not mistaken. Victor, right? Yeah, so from the beginning, he has been here with us a couple of times, and he comes to us with a very distinguished career. Currently he's a research professor, adjunct research professor of geography and environmental studies at Carleton University. And you could see here that he has had numerous research stints and teaching appointments around the world. So the Center for Global Studies is the most appropriate place for him to come, it seems. Having taught in China, in the Netherlands, in Finland, and at the Borders Policy Research Institute across the borders here in Washington University. As you can see here, beyond being a teacher and a researcher, Victor has also taken on the role of establishing the Canada-US Fulbright program between 1990 and 2001. And before this, he taught anthropology and was professor of anthropology and geography at the University of Maine, and the director of the Canadian American Center. And it won't be a surprise to hear for you that Victor Konrad was also very strongly involved in nurturing the borders studies community in Canada, but also globally. He served as a past president of the Association of Borderland Studies and the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. And if you listen to some of his recent book titles, you get a sense of where his research expertise lies. His recent books include North American Borders and Comparative Perspectives in 2020, Borders, Culture and Globalization, Canadian Perspective, 21, and Border Culture, Theory, Imagination, and Geopolitics, 22. So with this, it's a great pleasure having you back here, Victor, and we're curious to hear about your latest research.
Thank you very much. This has been a great opportunity for me to come to the Center for Global Studies and also to connect with a number of people that I've known and worked with over the years. What I'm going to present today is essentially a updated version of the final chapter of the book Border Culture, which is a book that Anwar El-Ansari and I published recently. Oliver just mentioned it, and it came out in e-version in December of 2022, and it is now out in a paperback version and also in a hardcover version in 2023, January 2023. So, Russia, getting to it's well, actually, I feel that this particular book encapsulates our current sense of border culture, and that means not only what Anwar and I think about it, but also what scholars around the world have been saying and doing in a way of trying to get a sense of what border culture really is. And with that comment, let's move on to the talk. Let's see if I can. Yeah, there we go. This this slide is a story, reflects a story in a sense that helps us to begin our discussion of border culture in a transnational context. And this story originates in Singapore, and I'm so pleased to have a researcher here from Thailand who was speaking with me just a few minutes ago about his experiences in that region. And so what I'd like to do is introduce you to suture, which is the acronym for the Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia Transnational Project. It was established in the 1990s, and it developed, in a sense, what has been referred to as next door transnationalism. It's not the only place in the world with next door transnationalism, but it is certainly emblematic of that. In other words, what this entails is a social construction of distinct polities, distant shared history in the region, a common set of cultural differences, but most pervasively, and this reflects a lot about transnationalism and globalization, is an aligned vision of economic growth and cooperation. Singapore has spilled across its boundaries, but citizenship and identity remain guarded in social and cultural communities. I'm sure a number of you here have read about Singapore and have studied its characteristics. There's certainly a lot written about it. There is a interethnic dissonance which prevails in the region, and borders matter. Borders that are both cultural and political at the same time. And so what we see here is a transnational integration of society and culture that's limited, or it's channeled through ethnic linkages such as the Chinese business community. And what we see is transnational culture in the suture cross-border region as a veneer of integration across imaginary frontiers, whereas the deeply rooted ethnic communities display operative borders to sustain what are cultural and actually physical islands within transnational culture. Here's a photograph that appears in the book, which is also very, very dramatic photograph that was shared with us by the Singapore business and promotional office. And it illustrates surrounding urban, new, business-oriented Singapore surrounding the Chinese enclave, the historically preserved Chinatown within the community. And this gives you a sense of the kind of point that I'm trying to make here. Culture has not readily and easily negotiated the transnational term. Culture is at once driving and responding to this term. And what we see is that culture is often central to these transnational transitions. Culture is, according to Clifford Geertz, a very prominent anthropologist, semiotic. It is expressed as webs, it is acted out, it is public, and it is immutable. And this culture is centered in transnationalism, and it has enabled culture as a flexible and adaptable process. That's according to Arjun Appadurai, who's one of the most prominent scholars working on transnationalism. So let's take a look at border culture a little more broadly in transnationalism, and then we'll focus on it in more specific ways. First of all, the precept of transnationalism remains partially rooted in nationalisms. So we have local and regional cultures that emerge or resist a national culture. And then we have diasporic dynamics that evolve from it. And all of this is woven together. The transnational imaginary, according to Salvador, remains unfulfilled because it has not fulfilled its transsentimental journey. And I like that particular term, this transsentimental journey. So that as a result of this, national and transnational remain intertwined but distinguishable. And this is an important takeaway point because it then offers us the opportunity to see borders as transnational culture, borders in transnational culture, and borders with / in or within transnational culture. In other words, there are essentially boundaries in the way we view transnational culture. This slide is from the Chinese border with Myanmar. This is one of the many informal crossings, or was one of the many informal crossings. I've now got documentation that subsequent to the pandemic, there have been walls constructed, fences constructed, and in some instances walls, but in most instances just fences with razor wire on top of them, which are also quite difficult for the local populations that tended to cross the border quite easily. So we have imagined and produced boundaries and an increasing array of sites where there are visions, values, identities, and other facets of human distinction meeting and colliding. In globalization, border culture at once is more elusive in dispersal of imaginaries and productions and more expressive in resistance to the recidivism of nation states. And in border culture, we have a working which is aligned with epistemologies of human discourse, with narration, with spatial behavior, and social construction. And all of these things are inclined toward geopolitics within a border culture context. So, borders within transnational culture. At each initiation or introduction to the chapters of the book, you will notice, if you've read the book or you're taking a look at it, you'll notice that we have a number of statements that key that particular chapter. And these are the statements that key the chapter 6 on transnational borders. Border culture is no longer culture at the margins, but rather it is culture at the heart of geopolitics. I'll spend a little bit more explaining what I mean exactly by that in a minute. We also raise a number of questions. Will borders become a bewildering array of binary cues? In other words, we're moving to a complete digitization of bordering and border relationships, and there is that particular possibility within transnational culture. And where is home in transnational space? We also, in the chapter, look at dispossession of culture, which begins in migration and ends in violence at the border. And the rationalization of border culture is counterproductive. Both Anna-Laura and I feel quite strongly that the border culture that is produced can't be rationalized as effectively as some other aspects of borders and bordering. And that border in itself in itself is an art, is the art. Whoops. A little too fast there. So this is the table of contents of the book with the chapter illustrated right at the end. I also wanted to show you this slide because I'm very, very proud of the cover illustration that that we have for the book. This was sourced by Anwar Ansari as a piece of border art that was made in France by a person that she knows, and it gives you a sense of the borders being both clear, delineated, yet at the same time on an earth that is potentially wobbly. So let's move to a consideration of border culture at the heart of geopolitics. We use the example in the book of Captain America's Empire, a very well-developed theme in popular culture. But it also conveys strong reflections of US identity and post-9/11 geopolitics through narratives and metaphors of the nationalist and transnationalist superhero. So that gives you a sense of how border culture fits right in the heart of geopolitics. It's dislocated and relocated in space and place, creating borders. Embodied borders may facilitate border management in a world of flows, but they also assure geopolitical alignment or separation and accompanying resistance, dispossession, and violence. Border culture is embodied as well, and it emerges and grows in these liminal borderland spaces, encountering, challenging, and or displacing other aspects of border culture. So as a result of this, we see transnational encompassing the antithetical geopolitical currents of containment and cooperation. We also see the transnational is about decolonialization and epistemic disobedience in order to question world powers and add value to culture. Border culture is associated with and defined by security regimes and resistance to these regimes. It's working.
It's working.
It's working. Okay, let's develop this a little bit further. I'm going to use the example of the Basque borderlands. I'm sure that most of you are familiar, if not with the region itself, certainly with the group that identifies itself as Basques, being both resident in France and resident in Spain, and being very much aligned with the European Union goals in one instance, and yet on the other hand being very localized. So this Basque illustration helps me to make a few points. First of all, the transnational is beyond representations of naturally discontinuous spaces of societies and cultures. Now, this is a point that was well made by anthropologists back in the 1990s. And furthermore, many scholars have talked about the atomized culture actually being less important than examining cultural difference. And that is certainly the case with regard to understanding border culture. So what we see is revealed conceptualizations of surveillance, panopticism, simulacra, deteriorization, hyperspace, marginality, and of course, borderlands. These are revealed conceptualizations that have originated out of our explorations of culture in the transnational world. And we've got contested cultural production. It's not consensual, shared, and orderly culture as we often see culture in our minds. And cultural production is ambiguous, yet citizenship requirements become more acute, identities are sharpened, and mobility matters, as my co-author has certainly pointed out in a number of her work. Just a point about diasporas, because they are illustrations of this phenomenon. The painting here from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, "When Home Won't Let You Stay," I think conveys very, very effectively. As you can see, the balls of twine with the strands leading in various locations around the world. It's almost similar to the thing that you have as a global studies illustration, isn't it? Yes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about diasporas, but only make a few quick points here. Some of the formative work on diasporas was done in the 1990s. People like Michael Kearney, for example. There's a great illustration of how the place of Oaxaca actually conveys its manifestation in a U.S. context in California, and yet the various subgroups from Oaxaca, whether they're Mixtec, Zapotec, Oaxacan, they have managed to establish a vision of their space in the new space, and that transference has been very effective. Here in Canada, we have African diaspora communities that identify as their national base in some instances, Nigerians, Ugandans, etc. But there's also a tendency for the African diaspora communities to base their identities on religion, in some instances on gender, in some other instances in terms of power. So this is a very complex situation. Diasporas create potentially multiple border crossings and borderlands and illustrate plural identities. So diaspora is then one vector of perpetual motion in human population. It's a globally mobile category of identification rather than, as Axel has pointed out, rather than individuals dispersed from the homeland. And our tendency in the past has been to look more on the individual basis. They have a what's referred to as a chaotic structure with dual territoriality, scenes of situational laterality, and scenes of archival specificity, in other words, linkage to a particular culture group. There's dual homeness, and then there's the establishment of what we know as 1.5 generations, people who have actually progressed beyond the original generation, but are still, in a sense, tied to that generation at the same time that they're part of a new generation. In addition to people, we have flows and objects in transnational space. Spaces of things constituted of objects that appear in transnational space according to multiple logics. In this particular photograph here, this is taken, it actually appears in the book, taken by Alessandro Brasile He calls it the night view of the Sea Memory Museum. That's that gives you a good hint as to what this is about. But you can see that this courtyard is full of objects, and those objects are placed in categories as opposed to being linked to the people. So the Sea Memory Museum then signifies the end of ownership and utility as objects mesh in these various stacks. So this is again a form of cultural change in transnational space. There are other aspects of this that need to be examined as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the embodied approach to transnational situates people in transnational space and reveals the ever-present valency of place. So place, centrality, and also objects may speak with multiple voices, and they may reveal a trace or an embodiment or memory storage. And Tuulikki Kurki, who works in Finland, has written very extensively about objects and how they work at and across borders. So from this, we move then to a profusion of border culture experience. In the book, we bring all of these things together and then evaluate them based upon what has been written, what has been discussed and debated with regard to the profusion of border culture experience. I won't go into great detail here, but minor languages erode but remain becoming and re-territorialized. We have a sense of struggle that prevails within transnationalism, and cultural interaction conveys that struggle. We see bordered culture and resultant hybridity and plurality of culture and transnationalism and having many discontents, creating a lot of border theater, but also there's a cultural space of integration and a post-border that emerges. This is according to Michael Deere, who's written extensively about that. And if any of you were at the Association of Borderland Studies recently, Michael presented on his book on border film, which is a very important new contribution to understanding the border culture that develops through the prism of film, which is extremely useful in that regard.
And Victor, we also did a podcast with him.
That's right.
We have a full interview. It's about 45 minutes, 55 minutes on this book.
Great.
It's on the book.
Yeah. So as you can see, there are continuities and intersections here that are extremely important. Artistic intervention is often a way of transforming artifacts of passage and control into cultural heritage. And cultural heritage is another aspect of border culture that I am just beginning to get engaged in. I made a presentation at the ABS just a few weeks ago, in which I'm looking at the cultural heritage of borders and tying this into one of the most prominent writers related to cultural heritage. And his name is David Lowenthal. He's a geographer. Those of you who are familiar with the field will have heard of him. And I think that's, Emmanuel, that's where my next book is going, border heritage. There's intervisuality, an implicit link between images anchored in their location on borders. What we're also seeing are artists operating at borders, responding to the visible order of official images by seeking to restore a certain opacity, in other words, making it less discernible in the geopolitical images in order to shape resistance to the dominant order. So there's this building of uncertainty that is extremely important. And we're seeing circuits of global contemporary art which encompass the motion and reimagined terrain of the transnational. I'm going to move along a little bit more quickly, or else we're not going to get through this. These two illustrations, I won't spend much time with them. One of them is from one of my research areas, which is the province of Yunnan in China, which is one of the most ethnically diverse. There are 26 ethnic minorities that are actually recognized by the Chinese government in Yunnan. And the point I'm trying to make here is that Yunnan, as we know, is a part of China, but when you put it separately like this, you take the map and you isolate the map. And then what you see is that the gray on the map is where there is a majority of the Han Chinese population. And so the Han Chinese population at most dominates 20% of Yunnan. So, and all of these ethnic groups, or virtually all of these ethnic groups, are found on both sides of the border with the countries adjacent to it. That's Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. So transnational culture mapped in that way, I think is very, very telling. And then of course, where is it headed? Where is transnational culture headed? This is a snapshot from the Open Borders 2050 project in which the idea conveyed here is the walls are parting, the fences are parting, and we are moving beyond this, maybe. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on world cities. This is a book into itself. There are many authors who have already looked at the culture of world cities. I'm drawing attention to it only in the sense that there are borders that are established away from the border, within the border culture of world cities. Saskia Sassen has written extensively about this, Edward Soja, and in geography, there are a number of people that have focused on this. The border culture of world cities is spatially compacted cultural imaginaries and manifestations that are attenuated connections of culture across time and space, in diasporas and migration chains, in the expansion of imaginaries, in new hybridities, adjacent to traditions, all associated with energy of motion and evolution. So there, if you want to read something about border culture of world cities, I would highly recommend Jeffrey Hume. Book was published in 2013. It's called Transcultural Placemaking, and it's an exceptionally valuable book to read. So we have in-betweenness, process of becoming, border cities, mobilizing intersection and interaction, and cultures are connected. Sometimes they coalesce, sometimes they resist, but always are activated and often evolve into new forms and expressions. Border culture is at once a manifestation and an imaginary. This is a art piece from the US-Mexico border, and what you see is the superimposition of an image on top of a wall. And I think it says a lot about this particular situation. There are claims and legitimization of space through marking belonging with graffiti. Many of us have seen works of graffiti applied to walls. Those of us who were in Israel for the ABS World Meeting certainly saw that throughout Israel on the border wall. It's apparent as well on the US-Mexico border wall and many other walls around the world. Less apparent perhaps in China, where new walls are going up because it's not tolerated. The graffiti is not tolerated to the same degree there. So what we have is border culture at a crossroads between the imaginary and the manifestation, and between space and border theory. This makes it very slippery to operate in a theoretical context when examining this situation. Culture is integral to borders in motion. A number of us have written a fair amount about borders in motion. My co-author Hannelore, there's a scholar by the name of Nail who's done a fair amount of work as well. And this motion has resulted in a uneven representation of culture in a spatial context. And what I've used here is the example, the illustration of TV drama co-production networks in Europe. And what you see there is how those co-production networks in this particular diagram are linked to centers, centers that don't necessarily reflect other aspects of the geography of Europe, but in this instance are very important to TV drama co-production. So that form of culture, in a sense, gets reshuffled. It gets developed. There are calls for more extensive exploration of forms of the border, zones of living with the border, and migrations crossing the border. Colleagues Johan Skamansky and Jopi Nyman from Norway and Finland have written very extensively about these kinds of changes in forms and zones and migrations. And I would suggest to you that if you want to follow up on that, it's important to look at their work. Understanding the geographies of creativity also involves looking at cultural psychology of borders, specifically what Marsico and Tateo have referred to as the tensional integrity, or they produced a new word, tensegrity, of cultural dialogue. Looking at cultural dialogue, looking at the social psychological aspects of how border culture is conveyed. I will be making a presentation to the psychologists who are interested in border studies next month in May. It's going to be one of these talks online, and there's a strong interest among a small but growing number of psychologists, cultural psychologists, they call themselves, about how border studies can understand the human social psychological dimensions of borders. So border studies is extending. Whoa, Oh, too fast. Okay, here, these panels essentially outline the very final part of the book and the final part of this chapter. Resolving border culture, cultures of post-globalization and post-humanistic borders. And what we do in this final part of the book is we select, and I must emphasize this, we select a number of aspects that we think are important. This is not to say that there are others that are not important, but this is where our thinking and the thinking of many other border culture specialists seems to be at this particular time with regard to borders within transnational culture. So one of the aspects that comes out very, very strongly is finding and staying at home in transnational space. It becomes an imperative. Then trying to convey the sense of both separation and integration. There have been a number of tropes that have been used in this regard. The suture and the scar, and these are essentially efforts on our part to designate this simultaneous separation and integration process that's going on. Then forwarding and foregrounding women, LGBTQ, indigenous peoples, and so on, in the way in which the border is evolving. There's a strong sense, for example, in the feminization of the border. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Migration at the border is seen as dispossession, and then border cultures are also revealed as violence. And in the final effort to try to pull some of these things together and end on a positive note, we focus on cultural landscapes in transnational space. So let me just very briefly comment on these aspects. In an effort to resolve border culture, at least move toward resolving border culture, we look at cultures of post-globalization and post-humanistic borders. These terms in various forms, I'm sure, are becoming familiar to you. Post-globalization is what we essentially call what's happening after globalization, because it's different than globalization. If you want to follow up a little bit more than that and argue with me about that, perhaps you can take a look at my article in the Journal for Borderland Studies 2021. There's a proliferation and an unsettling nature of more and more imposing borders, along with fluidity and shifting characteristics of borders, making border cultures always becoming and difficult to resolve. Also, humans have entered a post-humanistic era in which people have encountered limitations of nature and sparred with natural laws, and in response have propped up borders. Cultures of post-globalization and post-humanistic borders are exemplary of prevailing in-betweenness of the border world and the punctuated significance of both anchors and currents in border culture constructs. And what I'm going to do is just very briefly introduce those anchors and currents. First of all, staying home, finding home, and then staying. Access to home has become increasingly regulated through codes And I can give you many examples of that. But I want to move on to the second point, that COVID-19 and the enlarged has essentially enlarged home time and home space. And we have a whole bunch of federal employees now insisting that they actually stay home. I don't know if they have too many people that support that, but anyway, I won't get into the politics of that situation. In other words, sanctuary and utility have become more important. And sanctuary and utility are linked with home. There's been an expansion, a relocation, a contraction of home in transnational space. It's an anchored place, but it's fragile due to potential dispossession. I'm sure all of you recall the period of the late 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s, 2008, 2009, so in that area, when the United States went through a massive crisis in which homes were repossessed in massive numbers, millions and millions of homes were repossessed at that particular point. So we need to understand home more effectively. There are some books starting to come out on this. This one, Art, Borders, and Belonging, on home and migration, I highly recommend. The last point is that the space available for home is becoming increasingly limited in the post-humanistic field. This has a lot to do with climate change and the fact that home becomes more limited because home is out of reach for many people, and home is out of space. Just very quickly on the suture and the scar. There's a combined agency of border separation and integration, and we've always grappled with that in border studies, trying to deal with it. The trope of the suture has been used as one indication to move beyond the binary and to capture dualism, space of exception. Some border analysts have foregrounded sovereign power and bare life, like Anglo Men, for example. But my argument, and analysts as well, is that they miss the albeit messy yet revealing aspects of border culture with that kind of a characterization. Accordingly, the metaphor of the scar encompasses a broader and culturally more sensitive understanding of border dynamics. Mestiza is not transcending, but figuring the fundamental irresolution of the legislative order. In other words, what we're seeing is that these moves toward liminality, the moves toward mestiza, as it's called in Spanish, which is essentially an in-between space, that these are becoming more and more apparent. Border culture will not solve the border, but understanding it may help resolve human interaction with the border. At the very beginning of the book, we introduce a garden in Halifax, Canada, as one of the locales where we can situate a story of border and border culture. And in this instance, we have a photograph of Kamala's plot in the Glen Garden in Halifax. Kamala is one of the many Latsamba refugees who have established their garden in public plots in Halifax. I won't go into the entire story, but essentially what they've done is they brought a bit of their homeland into Halifax, and this enables them to do all sorts of things, to develop a sense of home, a sense of belonging, a sense of accomplishment, growing food that they're familiar with, and so on and so forth. But the point is here in having this photograph is to illustrate that the women are key in this. The women are central in that particular process. Men are also involved, children are also involved, but the women are central. So what we see, according to Sasson, is a feminization of survival in globalization. Female domestic workers are all around the world. They're the connectivity in many instances. There's a feminization of the word as violence against women as well. So there's the negative side to all of this. Undocumented migration is feminized. There's a feminization of asylum. Jennifer Heinemann, a number of other scholars have given us insight into that. And finally, there's even death. There's feminicide in Ciudad Juarez, for example. You've, I'm sure, heard of those instances in which the murder capital of the Americas essentially was a place where women died in a much larger proportion. I'm not going to go into detail about LGBTQ plus and indigenous groups and so on, but foregrounding of women and these other groups requires renewed attention in order to understand border culture. And I think one of the things that the 21st Century Borders Project is doing is foregrounding the indigenous pillar, and that's extremely critical. Migration as dispossession, and I'm going to move very quickly now because I want to finish up so we have some time for discussions. The border, according to Emilor, the border is a place of warning. Politics shakes out there. Opposition, there's an opposition between the protective inside and the dangerous outside, which is eroding. We see citizenship defined by exclusion and not inclusion, and we are losing our humanity at the killing borders. So the degree and intensity of dispossession impacts more on refugees, asylum seekers, people of color, and of women, as I've already pointed out. We've all heard in the media about the Uyghur dispossession in China and the various tactics that are engaged in that particular process. Things like spirit breaking, terror capitalism, even human engineering. Indigenous dispossession involves, according to Urban, who did a study in the Detroit-Windsor area, involves citing, and citing the role of the border. In other words, one has to look at it from all of these dimensions in regard to indigenous dispossession. Dispossession of indigenous territory and culture reverberates as sovereignty is wrested constantly as border space and place evolve. Some culture is left behind at the border, other culture is gained. Border is seen as a, in our perspective, we use this metaphor of the comb. It in a sense removes loose aspects and aligns cultural strands within different polities and different societies and different cultural values. Almost there. Borders, bullets, and business. Border seals out some, but also creates cultures of violence. So on one hand, you're sealing out violence or trying to see violence, but actually what you're doing is you're helping to create violence at the same time. Violence of border and violence of borderlessness. Nick Megarin has done a study on that. We see examples of Kurdish borderlands, the Northern Ireland situation, Boko Haram in Africa. There are many illustrations of this. A culture of violence and identity fragmentation results. And to know border violence, to comprehend and to understand border violence, we require an intersectional and decolonial approach. And this decolonial approach is extremely important in this regard. Ulrike Kirky, who I've already mentioned in another context, is doing tremendous research on border-related trauma narratives, trying to collect these trauma narratives to understand more effectively the impacts of this violence. And I end here with the video games. There's a video game called Borderlands. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's pretty violent and it's dangerous. And in this particular game, someone needs to fail, like in most games, right? And also what happens in this game is that violence aligns with racism and sexism. And that's where we see the insidious side of this situation. This is what they call the penultimate slide, the one that's before the last one, so the last one. Even in the game Borderlands, we see cultural landscapes, and these cultural landscapes form a component of contemporary transnational space. So what we're advocating in the book and in the chapter is that some extraordinary cultural landscapes exist amid a vast expanse of ordinary landscapes. There's been a lot of writing in border studies about ordinary and versus extraordinary. Even the extraordinary walls and fences are becoming ordinary. And some border cultural landscapes are appropriated from nature. They remain extraordinary indefinitely, agriculture, for example. Whereas others slip away. But this is important because cultural landscapes of and at borders are always in the process of becoming. They are becoming in a variegated fashion with prominences within a vast expanse of ordinary, everyday border culture experience. So we're suggesting that as one of our final takeaway points in the book and in this particular chapter, that it's the landscape approach, as a number of border scholars have already taught us in previous decades, that this landscape approach is very, very important for understanding border culture. Final steps towards situating border culture. We suggest 3 steps: revisit the interpretation of ordinary landscapes, insert aesthetics and politics. Cultural landscapes is where justice is defined and wielded. It's where borderscapes emerge, and this is where the geography actually becomes the art. Simultaneously, we enlarge the aperture to embrace the fluorescence of culture surrounding borders and focus on border culture within post-humanistic limits. There are some very positive signs, people who have been engaging with ways of conveying border culture more effectively. The biography of the border is an important element, and Nick Megarin's work on that. The cultural ecological context to re-engage uncommon ground, and the rebuilding of the bridge between culture and nature. All of these are important aspects in our estimation. So our final words are the final words to this presentation as well. In a post-humanistic era, extending beyond the initial flourish and acceleration of globalization is a growing realization that humans have extended beyond the limitations of nature and overstepped our bounds. Whether this realization will be expressed in a revised and more sensitive border culture remains to be seen. The culture of the post-humanistic border may be viewed as a prescript for human nature relationships. Alternatively, the culture of the post-humanistic border may be a postscript for human relations. As Jacques Rancière, and I forgot the grave on the E there, but anyway, as Jacques Rancière writes in The Edges of Fiction, which is one of his most recent books, we may move from the shores of the real to the edge of nothing and the all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Taking us to the most recent and daring and theoretically ambitious research on borders. I would like to open up the discussion. We touched on so many things, it's going to be interesting which one to hone in on. Anyone would like to step up?
I have a question.
Yes.
So a lot of things I'd like to ask you about, but I actually wanted to sort of start the question of history, because I didn't have a clear sense of sort of where you were starting in India, and you were covering a lot of things. I'm quite interested in sort of which moment you're sort of thinking about when you're looking at sort of recent phenomena that sort of that you're making and we're making. Because I was very struck by the slide of Yunnan. I also work with indigenous communities in Asia, so everyone's like, okay, more indigenous questions is always the focus I bring to the conversation. But I'm quite interested because I feel that when we talk about borders and nation states, we have to sort of first step back and think about indigenous communities who have been bifurcated by the borders, like they're sort of the original border making zones.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that they were trying to cross the borders crossed them,
Yes.
like bisected their territories. And if we look at the map of Russia and Japan, right through the middle of Ainu territory in the north, and that border, as I'm sure you know well, is still unsettled, right? There's never been a resolution to World War II. Or the Pacific War, as they call it, among other things. So that's just one example, but obviously the US-Mexico border, you brought up a very powerful example. Oaxaca, if you look at LA, it's crisscrossed by Oaxacan, diasporic communities, as you pointed out. So there's so many different sort of cases where we can look at this around the world. The Kumeyaay, right? The Kumeyaay in many indigenous communities like the Odom people have been fighting against the border wall for years. The US-Mexico border wall, like opposing it rather. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you kind of conceptualize the historical piece of this, sort of where you start this, and or how you sort of understand the indigenous piece in sort of question of borders. Sorry, it's rather giant.
No, it's a very important questions or more, actually, and it's important because I do not feel that border studies has effectively grappled with the space-time situation, right?
Yeah.
To put it in very simple, straightforward terms, we have a number of scholars who are historical border studies specialists. We have a number of scholars who work on the contemporary scene, even though the contemporary scene has depth as well, as you just pointed out. So how do we develop that? How do we possibly maintain control of that, especially with border culture? I mean, with the building of certain types of security structures, you have your timelines, you have your spatial delimitation, you can work out the time-space relationship. Not so easy with border culture, because there are so many different components to it, so many different facets of it. I pointed out in the talk. I mean, it's slippery. It's just, everywhere. We cannot manage it effectively in the way in which we convey our information with each other in an effective dialogue, right? That's what I think is very, very difficult. So I'm not trying to evade the question. I'm just saying that we are just in the process of trying to mesh. And we did this in Borders of Globalization to a certain extent by acknowledging the fact that we had a historical dimension, that we had a contemporary dimension, that we had all of these other dimensions. We started working that. But I think it's really with 21st century borders where you're really beginning to acknowledge the fact that at least one major component of the historical dimension, which also comes up into, you know, contemporary the situation, is the indigenous pillar. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to develop not just parallel pillars, but integrated approaches, because in the indigenous, there's also the indigenous feminine, right? And so on. You know, I'm just using that as one example. So those webs, those connective, those integrated things are going to have to be conveyed in some way. And I'm afraid we don't have the language for that yet. I'm cautiously optimistic that as we develop our understanding of border culture, we will be able to develop referents that make those types of connections. I don't want to go on and on here because it's a question that deserves a certain amount of reflection, I think. And I guess my point is what I said at the beginning, is that you're just not there with the language to deal with that. Okay.
Okay. I hope people online are not shy to raise their virtual hands. So if you want to come in, please let me know. Anyone? I don't see anything at the moment, but anyone in the room? Manuel, you smiled about, you know, the finding a language for this stuff, but yeah, okay. Yeah, sorry, and then we go to Sam.
Oh no, go to Sam.
Yeah, Sam, do you want to come in?
I thank you, Dr. Konrad. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it because it points to areas or approaches I could take, you know, in exploring the ideas I'm trying to write or talk about in my research project. And I have a question which is about how border cultures, how they evolve over time. Do you have any ideas for why, you know, border cultures sometimes evolve and sometimes change? Particularly, I'm talking based on my own experience in West Africa, where you see, for example, between Nigeria and the Benin Republic, which are neighboring countries, and you see people in Nigeria and Benin Republic, sometimes hold dual citizenships that are not considered legal. Benin Republic, people from Benin Republic who have Nigerian registration, Nigerian numbers and stuff like that, and people in Nigeria who have Benin Republic numbers and some kind of citizenship or some kind of registration. So, but over the years, we've seen that the interactions between people who live in both countries seem to have evolved, especially as trade begin to change and trade relations begin to change. Recently, the government of Nigeria just closed the border to trade in Benin Republic, and we see that people have started migrating to other areas of the country where they have access to trade with Nigeria and the like. So I'm wondering, how apart from governmental interventions, what are the factors that cause changes or evolution in border cultures. Thank you.
So if I understand your question correctly, you're inquiring about what drives the change in border culture?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, that again is one of these very big questions that is difficult to respond to, particularly in my instance, because I'm not familiar with that region that you're talking about. But my sense is that the tools that we use to try to comprehend border culture could be applied in that context as easily as they can in other contexts. What's necessary is to understand the first of all, the characteristics that convey the culture, that represent the culture in the area on one side of the border, and those that represent the culture on the other side of the border, and then to represent the hybrid or the integrated cultural context that occurs at the border. So often what this requires is a very complex approach in which you're looking at a number of different cultural contexts and trying to develop a sense of the key elements. Let's just use an illustration as an example here. Language. The language of the group on one side of the border, on the Nigerian side, and the language on the Benin side of the border may have some different characteristics, and then there may be an amalgam of those characteristics. Usually, language is a component within border culture because there's a hybridization of language that occurs through intensive border interaction. So my suggestion is that in order to comprehend this, one needs to be aware of the cultural details and characteristics on both sides of the border and at the border itself. Now that requires a fair amount of understanding and research that involves considerable amount of effort. So I think one of the reasons that we have difficulties with border culture is that it does require a tremendous amount of understanding of the scene. In other words, the scene is not what it appears, and it requires a tremendous amount of digging in order to find out what that entails. Anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent there. It's a very difficult question that you posed, one that essentially is asking for how one goes about in doing the border research. And in every instance, as in the example that I provided from China, in every instance, you have complicating situations. In China, you have all of these cultural minority groups represented. So understanding border culture in that context requires understanding the interactions among dozens and dozens of different cultural groups that are components within that area. The task is daunting, but it's certainly something that has its payoffs. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that point.
I have a question.
Randy,
How you doing, Victor? Hello, everyone. Syncretism or fusion is an essential concept in the study of border culture. But how does one approach the situations where hybridization, syncretism is not that evident? For example, when you have a relationship between two larger societies and cultures which that are asymmetrical, where one is dominant and the other is not. How does one approach that kind of situation?
well, first of all, I'd like to say that in cultural relations across borders, you very rarely ever see a situation in which you have a balance, in which there are more, let's say, in which there are a similar amount of cultural pressures and cultural elements crossing one way as opposed to the other way, just to use that way of explaining it. So in most instances, we see a domination of cultural messaging, cultural traits, various aspects of culture being conveyed from one side to the other. I know you're a specialist on the US Canadian situation, so we can certainly use that as an illustration of how that works. And my sense is that one needs to step back from taking one perspective from one side of the border as opposed to the perspective from the other side of the border, and try to take out those elements in comprehending what's going on. Take out the biases, take out the aspects that make you see the border through only one set of eyes, because that's what's happened to a very large degree in a global context. Border culture has often been conveyed by one dominant culture as opposed to the culture that it's interacting with. And as a result of that, we get slanted perspectives on what border culture is. So it's important to try and adjust for that in the analysis.
Well, I'll just jump in one very quick observation. When I first moved to Regina, the window into America was provided by, largely for people here, was American television that came from small cities just across the border, like Minot and Williston. And that in that transnational region, there's a sharing of many kinds of cultural attributes. Example from, at the dominance of agriculture. So no matter what side of the border you're on, you hear reports about agricultural markets. But when cable kicked in, the window into America for Reginians became Detroit and Atlanta, the superstations. And so those cultural messages changed from a much broader perspective. So the view changed. And I would argue that the ties diminished somewhat at different levels. So it's an interesting thing to look into.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's a good illustration. And just to add to that, it becomes more complicated by the fact that Canadians and Americans spend certain amounts of time in the other country. And they take back very personalized snapshots of cultural situations, cultural facets and the other side of the border. So this becomes highly individualized in many ways, yet at the same time, it's also molded by these dominant media that are involved in it.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think we could spend another day or two probably, continuing the different trajectories of research that you've laid out. Should we go for one or two more? I see Amit, has a question. Maybe we go back and then see whether we still have time for one more after that. Amit, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for that enlightening session. I have just a quick question. I'm situated in South Asia right now in India. So I did my postgrad in international relations and I work on the borders, and I particularly work on the border culture. So when we talk about the border culture, to what extent the nature of the state plays the role in the cultural assimilation of the borderland communities? As we talk about the Western case like US and Canada, we have democracies working out there. But in South Asia and Asian context, we have China and India sharing border at the line in the Ladakh region. So we have this nomadic community by the name Changpa, or we better know them as Tibetan nomads who produce this Pashmina wool. So this community is basically bifurcated into two sections right now. One is in Tibet in Chinese control, and the other remaining section is in the Indian control right now. So I had this really interesting thing going on in my mind. To what extent the state plays the role in their cultural assimilation? So that's my question right now.
Could you just clarify or repeat that? I didn't quite catch what the question was.
Oh, okay. The question is, to what extent the government or the nation, the state type, plays a role in the cultural assimilation of the borderland communities?
Okay. Well, it's very clear from examples taken from a extensive global context that government clearly does play a major role. But at the same time, border communities establish their own form of culture, partly through family connections across the border, partly through trading relationships, partly through cooperation of various kinds. And in many instances, that culture does not reflect the cultural expression of the state on either side of the border. In some instances, these border communities become more and more integrated because there is a certain distance from the center of the state. And in some instances, the state has less of an interest in expunging that development of homegrown culture that we see at the border itself. Yet in other instances, the state message predominates, and that state message is hammered home in a very, very incisive way in the border communities, to the effect that there is violence, dispossession, and all of these other things that I talked about. So in the Canada-US context, it's a relatively benign situation. In the Mexico The US context, less so. Although still, we have a strong borderland community established, or communities established all the way along the extensive United States-Mexico border. And the term borderlands and the realization of border culture actually comes from the early writings of scholars in that area. That's where the definitions were initially carved out. So I think I've responded to your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that.
Definitely haven't had any easy questions for you, right? But I think you asked for it, but
Yeah, as soon as you raise culture,
right, I know.
then suddenly, you know,
It's a fascinating field of research, but also challenging in terms of concepts. But I think the more you go through these illustrations on the ground, I think it becomes very clear the role that culture plays in these border regions. So I think we have to bring this to a close. Thank you very much, Victor, for being here with us. Thank you all joining us online and here in the room. It was a great pleasure. And we had, I'm not sure whether we have a copy at the center of your book, but definitely you have stimulated our interest in reading it. So thank you very much, Victor, for that.
yeah, thank you.